The darkness over occupied France hung thick as oil on the night of August 14th, 1944. No moon, no stars visible through the cloud layer. Just the kind of pitch-black void that made formation flying a nightmare and navigation an act of faith. Somewhere below that ceiling of clouds, a Heinkel He 177 bomber droned westward, heading toward Allied positions at 320 miles per hour. The German crew couldn't see the American fighter stalking them from 6 miles away. They had no idea that electromagnetic pulses were bouncing off their fuselage, painting a glowing blip on a radar scope in total darkness. They didn't know that a 3-man crew in a massive black aircraft had been tracking their every move for the past 8 minutes, closing the distance with methodical precision. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow hung in the night sky like its namesake. 49 feet of twin-boomed Predator, painted glossy black because testing had proven it was virtually invisible in searchlight beams. In the cramped nose, radar operator Philip Porter watched the target grow brighter on his SCR 720 display. The bomber was now 2 miles ahead, slightly below, moving right to left across their approach vector. Porter's voice came through the intercom, calm and precise. Range, bearing, altitude. The pilot made micro-adjustments to course and power settings. The gunner in the dorsal turret waited, hands resting on the firing controls for 4 50 caliber Browning machine guns. Below them, in the ventral tray, 4 20mm Hispano cannons pointed forward into the black void. 1 mile out now. The Heinkel crew still had no warning. German radar detectors could pick up Allied H-2S bombing radar, but the SCR 720 operated on a different wavelength. It was hunting them in silence. The P-61 closed to half a mile. Porter confirmed target identification. The pilot eased the Black Widow into attack. Position, lining up his gun sight with the invisible bomber ahead. Then, the night erupted. 8 weapons firing in perfect concert. Tracer rounds arcing through darkness. 20mm shells punching through aluminum skin and finding fuel tanks, engines, control surfaces. The Heinkel tried to dive away, but it was already finished. Flames bloomed orange against the cloud base as the bomber began its terminal descent toward the French countryside below. The entire engagement had lasted 93 seconds. From first radar contact to confirmed kill, the German crew had never seen their attacker. They had been fighting an enemy from the previous war's playbook, while the Americans had brought technology that made darkness irrelevant. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the future of aerial combat, and the Luftwaffe was just beginning to understand how catastrophically outmatched they had become. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By mid-1944, the night sky over Europe had become a 3-dimensional chessboard where technology mattered more than courage. The Luftwaffe had spent 4 years perfecting night fighting tactics, ground-controlled interception systems, radar-equipped fighters, specialized crews who could navigate by stars and find targets illuminated by searchlights and burning cities. They were very good at it. Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, the Luftwaffe's top night fighter ace, had shot down 121 RAF bombers, all during night operations. The Germans understood darkness. They had weaponized it during the Blitz. They had developed countermeasures when the British started bombing Germany at night. By 1944, their night fighter force was a sophisticated defensive system that had inflicted terrible losses on RAF Bomber Command. But the P-61 represented something Germans hadn't anticipated. Not an improvement on existing technology, a complete paradigm shift. The Black Widow could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 5 miles in total darkness. It could track multiple targets simultaneously. It could close to firing position without the enemy ever knowing it was there. And it carried firepower that could shred a bomber or a fighter in a single sustained burst. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. German pilots who survived encounters with P-61s reported the same terrifying pattern. They would be flying their mission, maintaining radio silence, using every technique they had learned to stay invisible in the darkness. Then, without warning, without any visual or electronic alert, tracer fire would tear through their aircraft from an enemy they never saw coming. Intelligence reports filtering back to Luftwaffe command painted an increasingly grim picture. The Americans had deployed a night fighter that could hunt in conditions where previous aircraft were essentially blind. More importantly, they had deployed it in numbers. By August 1944, 2 full night fighter squadrons of P-61s were operating over France, the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron and the 425th Night Fighter Squadron, both flying missions deep into German-controlled airspace. The development of the Black Widow traced back to a desperate moment in British history. The autumn of 1940, during the Blitz. German bombers hammered London and other British cities night after night. RAF fighters could intercept them during daylight raids, but once darkness fell, the advantage shifted completely to the attackers. British night fighters were essentially day fighters trying to operate in conditions they weren't designed for. The pilots would take off, climb to patrol altitude, and hope to spot a bomber silhouetted against searchlights or fires. Sometimes they got lucky. Usually they didn't. In an 8-month period, German night raids killed more than 43,000 British civilians and left 1 in 6 Londoners homeless. The defenders needed a technological solution because tactical adjustments weren't working. That solution came from radar. The British had been experimenting with airborne intercept radar since 1936, but early sets were massive and crude. They worked in theory. In practice, they were too large to fit in existing fighters and too unreliable for consistent operational use. Then, in 1940, British scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment developed the cavity magnetron. This single invention made microwave radar practical for aircraft installation. The breakthrough crossed the Atlantic through intelligence-sharing agreements between Britain and America, U.S. Army Air Corps observers in England during 1940 and 1941 watched the night bombing campaign firsthand. They saw the same problem Britain faced. They recognized that America would need dedicated night fighters if war came, and they knew existing American aircraft weren't suitable for conversion. Jack Northrop, the California aerospace engineer, saw the opportunity clearly. A purpose-built night fighter. Not a day fighter with radar bolted on as an afterthought. An aircraft designed from the ground up around airborne intercept radar and the specific requirements of night combat. In October 1940, Northrop submitted his proposal to the U.S. Army Air Corps. The competition came down to 2 designs, Northrop's radical twin-boom configuration and a more conventional proposal from Douglas Aircraft. Northrop won. On December 5, 1940, the Army approved the P-61 design. On January 10, 1941, Northrop received a contract for 2 prototypes. The specifications were ambitious to the point of seeming impossible. The aircraft needed to patrol for at least 8 hours. It needed to carry enough fuel for extended missions over occupied Europe. It needed multiple gun turrets for defensive capability. It needed space for a 3-man crew, pilot, radar operator, and gunner. Most critically, it needed to incorporate radar that didn't exist in operational form yet. The Bell Telephone Laboratories and MIT's Radiation Laboratory were developing the SCR-520 radar system, but it wasn't ready. Northrop was designing an aircraft around a technology that was still being refined in laboratories. The risk was enormous. If the radar failed to materialize or didn't work as promised, the entire program would collapse. By early 1942, both technologies were converging. The radar worked. The aircraft was taking shape. On April 2, 1942, the Army Air Corps mock-up board reviewed Northrop's prototype and made a critical design change. The original plan mounted 20mm cannons in the wings. The board moved them to a fixed position in the lower fuselage, clustering all 4 cannons together. This eliminated convergence problems and created a devastating concentration of firepower. On May 26, 1942, test pilot Vance Breeze took the P-61 prototype airborne for the first time from Northrop Field in Hawthorne, California. The aircraft was enormous by fighter standards, 49 feet long with a wingspan of 66 feet, empty weight 23,000 pounds. With full fuel and ammunition, it weighed over 30,000 pounds, larger than many medium bombers. But it flew like a fighter. Breeze put it through a series of maneuvers that would have torn apart a less robust airframe. The Black Widow could roll, loop, and dive with surprising agility for its size. It could perform every maneuver except outside loops, sustained inverted flight, and deliberate spins. More importantly, it demonstrated excellent single-engine controllability. If one engine failed, the pilot could maintain full control and return to base. This was critical for night operations where ditching or bailout in darkness meant almost certain death. The twin-boom configuration served multiple purposes. It provided structural strength while keeping the tail surfaces clear of propeller wash. It created space for radar equipment in the nose without compromising the weapon's installation. And it gave the radar operator room to work without cramping the pilot. Every design element reflected lessons learned from British night fighter operations. Production began in October 1943. The first P-61, as rolled off the Northrop assembly line painted in standard olive drab over neutral grey. Then someone ran an experiment. They flew different paint schemes into searchlight beams at night and observed the results. Olive drab showed up clearly. Flat black was better but still visible. Glossy black was virtually invisible. The searchlight beam would sweep across the aircraft and see nothing. Every subsequent Black Widow came out of the factory painted glossy black from nose to tail. The paint scheme became the aircraft's signature. In darkness, from any angle, against any background, the P-61 was a ghost. German searchlight operators would sweep their beams across the sky and miss Black Widows flying directly through the light cone. The radar system that made it all possible was a masterpiece of wartime electronics. The SCR-720 operated at 10 centimeters wavelength, transmitting electromagnetic pulses forward in a 180-degree arc. When those pulses struck another aircraft, they bounced back to the receiver. The radar operator saw returns as glowing blips on two displays. One showed range and bearing, the other showed elevation. The system could detect bombers at distances exceeding 5 miles in ideal conditions. Against fighters, the range dropped to around 3 miles, but that was still far beyond visual range in darkness. The radar operator would guide the pilot toward the target, calling out course corrections until they closed to about 1 mile. Then the pilot would take over using a smaller scope mounted on his instrument panel. This scope had a maximum range of approximately 1 mile and showed the target's exact position relative to the P-61's nose. Once the Black Widow closed to around 1,000 yards, the pilot could usually acquire visual contact if any ambient light existed. Moonlight, starlight, fires on the ground. The glow from the target's exhaust. At that point, the engagement became traditional dogfighting, except one aircraft had been stalking the other for several minutes without being detected. The weapons system was equally sophisticated. The 4 20mm Hispano M2 cannons sat in the ventral tray, clustered close together and firing forward. Each gun had a magazine holding 60 rounds. Total ammunition, 240 rounds of high-explosive incendiary shells that could rip through airframes, puncture fuel tanks, and detonate control surfaces. Rate of fire, approximately 600 rounds per minute per gun. In a 3-second burst, all 4 cannons would throw 72 shells at the target. That kind of firepower could destroy a bomber before it even knew it was under attack. Pilot after-action reports from 1944 describe engagements lasting less than 5 seconds. Radar contact. Intercept. Firing pass. Target destroyed. The Germans were fighting a war where they needed several lucky breaks to score a kill. The Americans had industrialized the process. The dorsal turret added another dimension: 4 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns in a remotely controlled General Electric turret. The turret could rotate 360 degrees and elevate 90 degrees, giving it coverage across almost the entire hemisphere above and to the sides of the aircraft. The gunner or radar operator could control it, tracking targets with a gyroscopic sight that computed lead angles automatically. Each machine gun held 560 rounds. Total ammunition: 2,240 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition. Enough firepower to engage multiple targets during a single mission. The turret was the same type fitted to the forward upper position on B-29 superfortresses, and B-29 production took priority. As a result, many early P-61s rolled off the assembly line without the turret installed. Only the first 37 production A models had it. Training began immediately. The 348th Night Fighter Squadron at Orlando Army Air Base in Florida received the first production aircraft. Their mission? Create a training program that would produce 3-man crews capable of coordinating during night combat. Pilot, radar operator, and gunner working as a single unit in total darkness. The learning curve was steep. Night fighting required different skills than day combat. Spatial awareness without visual references. Instrument flying for hours at a time. The discipline to trust instruments over instinct when your inner ear told you the aircraft was banking but the artificial horizon said it was level. The radar operators faced the steepest challenge. They were learning to use technology that hadn't existed in operational form 3 years earlier. Reading the scope displays, filtering out ground clutter, distinguishing between friendly and enemy returns, computing intercept vectors in real time while the pilot made constant course adjustments. A good radar operator could mean the difference between a kill and watching the target escape into the night. By February 1944, the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron completed training and deployed to England aboard the RMS Mauretania. The 425th Night Fighter Squadron followed on the RMS Queen Elizabeth. The crews arrived at their bases expecting to find their aircraft waiting. Instead, they found empty hangars and a bureaucratic nightmare. The P-61s hadn't arrived yet. Supply chain delays, shipping priorities, the 1,000 small failures that plagued every military operation. Worse, they discovered that several USAAF generals, including General Hoyt Vandenberg, believed the P-61 was too slow for night fighter operations. The Black Widow had a maximum speed of 366 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, fast for a bomber, adequate for a night fighter, but slower than many German aircraft it would face. The Focke-Wulf 4-190 could hit 426 miles per hour. The Messerschmitt Bf 110 could make 342. If a target decided to run, could the P-61 catch it? General Karl Spaatz, commanding officer of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, requested de Havilland Mosquito night fighters to equip American squadrons. The British refused. Mosquito production was stretched thin, supporting RAF operations. The Americans would have to make do with what they had, or prove the Black Widow could do the job. At the end of May 1944, the USAAF organized a competition. RAF crews flying Mosquito Mark 17s versus American crews from the 422nd NFS flying P-61s. Head-to-head trials, speed tests, maneuverability assessments, mock combat engagements. The results surprised the skeptics. The Mosquito was faster in level flight and climbed better. But the P-61 turned tighter. It had better low-speed handling, and its radar, the American SCR-720 system, outperformed the British AI Mark X in range and reliability. The competition judges declared it essentially a draw. Both aircraft could perform the night fighter mission effectively. The P-61 would stay in service. By late June 1944, the Black Widows finally arrived in England. The 422nd NFS began flying patrol missions over the English Channel, learning the terrain, practicing coordination with ground control stations. On July 15th, they scored their first attempted kill. Lieutenant Hermann Ernst got vectors to intercept a Vone flying bomb heading toward London. He closed to firing range and opened up with his cannons. The plastic rear cone on the Vone imploded from the pressure wave. The flying bomb tumbled into the sea intact. Mission failure. The next night, Ernst got another chance. Another Vone. Another intercept. This time he stayed further back, compensating for the pressure effect. His cannons shredded the flying bomb's pulse jet engine. The Vone nosed over and detonated in an empty field, first confirmed kill for the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron, but V-1s weren't the real test. They were unmanned cruise missiles, flying straight and level at predictable altitudes. The real test came on the night of August 14th to 15th, when the squadron transferred to Maupertus, France, and began hunting manned aircraft over occupied territory. Lieutenant Colonel O.B. Johnson, the squadron's commanding officer, took his Black Widow up into darkness over Normandy. Ground control vectored him toward multiple radar contacts. German bombers attempting harassment raids against Allied positions. Johnson's radar operator picked up a contact at 4 miles range. They closed to 2 miles, 1 mile. Visual acquisition, a Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighter, probably on the same kind of patrol Johnson was flying. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. 2 radar-equipped night fighters stalking each other in darkness. But the P-61 saw the Bf-110 first. Johnson positioned for a firing pass. His cannons and machine guns tore into the German aircraft before it could react. The Bf-110 went down north of Barfleur. Minutes later, another contact. A Focke-Wulf 4-190, either a night fighter variant or a ground attack aircraft heading back to base. Johnson's Black Widow had already taken anti-aircraft fire from German positions, damaging his hydraulics and puncturing fuel lines. He should have broken off and returned to base. Instead, he pursued. The Foul 190 never saw him coming. Second kill of the night for Lieutenant Colonel Johnson. The commanding officer had just demonstrated exactly what the P-61 could do. Other aircraft from the 422nd weren't as fortunate. Impatient Widow, flown by another crew, attempted to intercept a Heinkel He-177 bomber. The Heinkel's gunners spotted the Black Widow during the approach and opened fire. Defensive guns from a German bomber scoring hits on an American night fighter. The starboard engine on Impatient Widow erupted in flames, oil lines severed, hydraulics destroyed. The P-61 went down in the channel. The crew didn't survive. That loss taught a crucial lesson. The Black Widow had overwhelming advantages in technology and firepower, but it wasn't invulnerable. If a target spotted the attacker during the final approach, if defensive gunners got lucky, the night could turn deadly for the hunter. The key was maintaining surprise until the last possible moment. Close quickly, identify positively, shoot accurately. Don't give the target time to react. The 425th Night Fighter Squadron scored their first kill shortly after the 422nd, and by autumn both squadrons had settled into operational patterns. They flew 2 types of missions: defensive patrols protecting Allied positions from German night raiders, and offensive intruder missions deep into German-controlled territory, hunting for targets of opportunity. The defensive missions followed predictable patterns. German bombers, usually Junkers Ju-88s, Dornier Do 217, or Junkers Ju-188s, would attempt harassment raids against Allied supply lines, troop concentrations, or forward airfields. Ground control stations would pick them up on radar and vector P-61s to intercept. The Black Widows would climb to patrol altitude, loiter until they got vectors, then close on the bombers before they reached their targets. Success rates were high. The German bombers flew alone or in small groups, using darkness as their primary defense. Against aircraft without radar, that worked. Against the P-61, it was suicide. Radar operator picks up contact. Pilot closes to visual range. Cannons open fire. Target destroyed. The whole engagement might last 3 minutes from first contact to confirmed kill. The offensive intruder missions were more complex and far more dangerous. Black Widows would fly deep into German territory after dark, looking for trains, truck convoys, locomotives, rail yards, anything moving on German supply lines. The pilots would fly low, sometimes below 500 feet, using the darkness and their black paint scheme to stay invisible. When they spotted a target, they'd make a single firing pass with cannons and rockets, then climb back into the safety of altitude and darkness. These missions achieved remarkable results for minimal losses. The 422nd NFS was credited with damaging or destroying 448 trucks, 50 locomotives, and 476 rail cars during their service in Europe. The 425th NFS flew 1,162 intruder missions between October 1944 and May 1945. They lost only 6 aircraft. Despite flying at night through flak-defended areas, hunting targets on the ground, these missions proved safer than daylight operations. The reason was simple. German anti-aircraft gunners couldn't see the Black Widows coming. By the time they heard engines overhead, the P-61 had already made its attack run and climbed away. Searchlights would sweep the sky looking for the glossy black aircraft and find nothing. The Germans were fighting blind against an enemy that owned the night. But the most psychologically devastating missions were the pure hunter-killer patrols. No defensive responsibility, no ground attack requirement, just P-61s prowling German airspace looking for Luftwaffe aircraft to destroy. These missions turned the tables completely on German night fighter tactics. For years, the Luftwaffe had been the predator, hunting RAF bombers in darkness. Now they were the prey. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German pilots returning from missions over France in late 1944 began reporting encounters that didn't fit their training or experience. They'd be flying their patrol route, maintaining radio silence, using every technique they knew to stay undetectable. Then tracer fire would erupt from the darkness, no warning, no visual contact, no electronic alert from their radar detectors, just sudden, devastating firepower from an enemy they couldn't see. The survivors described the same pattern. First indication of trouble was usually cannon strikes on their aircraft. By the time they reacted, the attacker was already breaking off or repositioning for another pass. In most cases, the German pilots never actually saw the P-61. They saw muzzle flashes, tracer rounds, their own aircraft coming apart around them, but the actual American fighter remained invisible in the night sky. This was psychological warfare at its most effective. The Luftwaffe's night fighter pilots were experienced professionals. Many had dozens of kills. They understood night combat intimately. They knew every trick for staying alive in darkness, and none of it worked against the Black Widow. The Americans had technology that made traditional night fighting skills irrelevant. German intelligence services tried to gather information about this new threat. They knew the Americans had deployed a large, twin-engine night fighter. They knew it carried radar. They had rough specifications from pilot reports and wreckage analysis, but they didn't understand the full extent of the P-61's capabilities, the SCR-720, radar's actual range, the automatic fire control systems in the dorsal turret, the way American crews were trained to coordinate during engagements. More critically, they didn't appreciate the philosophical difference between German and American approaches to night fighting. The Luftwaffe had developed night fighters by adapting existing aircraft. Take a Bf-110D fighter, add radar, train the crew, deploy it at night. The result worked well enough against bombers, but it was still fundamentally a day fighter operating in darkness. The P-61 was something different. Every system, every design choice, every operational procedure had been created specifically for night combat. The aircraft didn't just carry radar, it was built around radar. The crew didn't just use darkness, they were trained to exploit it systematically. The Black Widow wasn't adapted for night fighting, it was night fighting incarnate. By December 1944, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. The German offensive in the Ardennes, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, put pressure on Allied defensive positions throughout Belgium and France. Bad weather grounded most Allied aircraft. Heavy clouds, snow, freezing temperatures, conditions that made daylight operations nearly impossible. But night operations continued. P-61s, from the 422nd and 425th NFS flew cover missions over the besieged town of Bastogne. They patrolled supply routes. They hunted for German bombers attempting to hit Allied positions under cover of darkness. And they encountered a new type of target, Luftwaffe night fighters that had been pressed into ground attack roles. On December 17th, several German night fighter squadrons launched large-scale ground attack operations, supporting von Rundstedt's offensive. Dozens of aircraft at a time, searching for Allied targets along highways and railroads, these missions achieved mixed success at extremely high cost. The German pilots were insufficiently trained for ground attack. They encountered accurate anti-aircraft fire, and they flew into airspace patrolled by P-61s. The Black Widows of the 422nd and 425th found these operations to be target-rich environments. German night fighters, Bf-110s and Ju-88s, flying low and slow while searching for ground targets. Perfect conditions for radar-guided interception. The P-61s stalked them methodically, picking off individual aircraft as they completed their attack runs. The German night fighters proved more challenging opponents than the bombers and transport aircraft the Americans usually encountered. These were experienced crews with radar of their own. On several occasions, they detected their pursuers and managed to evade. Some claimed victories against P-61s, though these claims were later disproven. The war diarist for Stab NJG-6 even noted with confidence that the Black Widow inferior to Ju-88 and Bf-110 in dogfighting. That assessment reflected survivor bias more than technical reality. German pilots who escaped P-61 attacks reported that they had outmaneuvered their pursuers. They didn't mention the crews who never came back. The ones who got tracked on radar, intercepted in darkness, and shot down before they could react. Several German night fighters were confirmed destroyed by P-61s during this period, and the actual kill ratio likely favored the Americans significantly. What the Germans failed to appreciate was that the Black Widow wasn't designed for dogfighting. It was designed for stalking. The P-61 crew would detect a target at 5 miles range, close to visual contact without being seen, identify the target positively, and destroy it with overwhelming firepower before the enemy knew an engagement had begun. If the target somehow detected the attack and initiated evasive maneuvers, the P-61 would often break off and reacquire, rather than pursuing into a turning fight. This tactical doctrine frustrated German pilots who survived encounters. They'd detect something behind them, pull hard evasive maneuvers, and the American fighter would disappear. They'd report that they'd successfully evaded or driven off the attacker. In reality, the P-61 crew had simply decided the element of surprise was lost and went looking for an easier target. There were always more aircraft in the night sky. By early 1945, German resistance in the air was collapsing. Fuel shortages grounded most Luftwaffe units. The pilots who could still fly were exhausted, poorly trained replacements. Allied air superiority had become so total that daylight operations were virtually suicide for the Germans. Night operations offered slightly better survival odds, but P-61s and RAF Mosquitoes controlled the darkness now. The Black Widows shifted focus from air-to-air combat to ground attack and reconnaissance missions. They'd fly deep into German territory, photographing targets, attacking supply lines, forcing German supply convoys to operate without lights and slowing their movement to a crawl. The psychological effect was devastating. German troops knew that American night fighters were patrolling overhead. They knew those fighters had radar that could see in total darkness. So they huddled in forests, moved only when absolutely necessary, and waited for the end. The P-61's operational record in Europe told a story of technological dominance. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron produced 3 ace pilots and 2 ace radar operators. The radar operators shared credit for kills with their pilots, acknowledging that night fighting was a team effort requiring perfect coordination between crew members. The 425th officially claimed no aces, but their operational effectiveness was measured in missions flown, targets destroyed, and the simple fact that Allied bomber losses to night fighters dropped dramatically once Black Widows entered service. Total confirmed kills for P-61s in the European theatre: 53 manned aircraft and 9 German Wohn flying bombs. Those numbers sound modest compared to day fighter aces who racked up dozens of kills each. But night fighting operated under different rules. Targets were scarce, weather frequently prevented operations. Many encounters never resulted in visual contact because the enemy aircraft disappeared into clouds or dove for the deck before the P-61 could close to firing range. What mattered more than raw kill numbers was the strategic impact. German night operations became exponentially more dangerous once the Black Widow deployed. Luftwaffe bombers couldn't harass Allied positions without risking interception by radar-equipped fighters. German supply movements at night slowed to a crawl because drivers knew American night fighters were hunting them. The psychological pressure of knowing that darkness no longer offered protection wore down German morale throughout the final months of the war. The P-61 had achieved exactly what it was designed to do. It had taken control of the night sky. It had made darkness a weapon for the Americans instead of a defensive barrier, and it had demonstrated a principle that would define air warfare for the next 70 years. Advanced sensors and fire control systems mattered more than raw speed or maneuverability. The Pacific Theater told a different story, but the lesson remained the same. Japanese forces had perfected their own version of night harassment. Lone bombers would fly over Allied positions after dark, dropping bombs, strafing airfields, preventing American troops from sleeping. They called them washing machine Charlie missions because the unsynchronized engines on Japanese bombers made a distinctive rattling sound. Annoying, demoralizing, and nearly impossible to stop with conventional defenses. The 6th AH Night Fighter Squadron on Guadalcanal received their first P-61s in early June 1944. They began flying patrols immediately, learning the peculiar challenges of tropical night operations: violent thunderstorms, dense cloud layers, navigation over endless ocean where one mistake meant death because there was nowhere to land except water. On June 30th, 1944, Second Lieutenant Dale Haberman and his radar operator Flight Officer Raymond Mooney were flying their Black Widow, nicknamed Moon Happy, on patrol over Saipan. Ground control vectored them toward a radar contact heading toward American positions. Haberman's radar operator picked up the target at 4 miles range. They closed steadily. 3 miles, 2 miles. Visual acquisition in the moonlight. A Mitsubishi G4M bomber, the type Americans called Betty, flying alone at 8,000 feet. Haberman positioned for attack. His cannons opened fire. The Betty's fuel tanks erupted. The bomber pitched forward and spiraled into the Pacific. First confirmed P-61 kill in the Pacific Theater. Moon Happy had been in combat operations for exactly 5 days. The Japanese had just learned what the Germans were learning simultaneously in Europe. Darkness no longer protected them. Throughout summer and fall 1944, P-61 squadrons spread across the Pacific. The 419th Night Fighter Squadron at Bougainville, the 421st at Nadzab, the 547th at Owi. Each squadron covered vast expanses of ocean and jungle, patrolling over bases, supply routes, and invasion beaches. Most missions ended without contact. The sky was enormous, and individual aircraft were specks. But when contact occurred, the results were usually decisive. Japanese bombers flying alone at night stood no chance against radar-equipped fighters. The P-61 would detect them at extreme range, close undetected, and destroy them before they reached their targets. Japanese pilots began reporting the same phenomenon their German counterparts described: invisible attackers striking from the darkness with overwhelming firepower. The tactical situation in the Pacific differed significantly from Europe. German bomber formations included dozens of aircraft with coordinated defensive fire. Japanese harassment raids typically involved single aircraft or small groups, making them easier targets but harder to find. A P-61 crew might patrol for 6 hours and never see an enemy aircraft. Then, on the next mission, they'd encounter a formation of 4 or 5 bombers and shoot down 3 in 20 minutes. By early 1945, the pattern was clear across both theatres. Allied air superiority had become so complete that Axis powers couldn't mount effective daylight operations. Night remained their only option for moving supplies, attacking targets, or even flying reconnaissance, and the P-61 was systematically eliminating that option. The Black Widow squadrons shifted increasingly to offensive operations. In the Pacific, they flew interdiction missions against Japanese shipping and ground transport. In Europe, they hunted locomotives and supply convoys. The crews discovered that their radar, designed to track aircraft, worked remarkably well for ground mapping. They could identify cities, rivers, coastlines. They could find moving vehicles by their heat signatures. The technology kept revealing new applications, but the war was ending. By April 1945, Germany was collapsing. Hitler was dead. The Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of fuel. P-61 crews over Europe were flying missions where the biggest danger was boredom and navigation error. In the Pacific, Japan was being strangled by submarine blockade and firebombing. Japanese aircraft were becoming increasingly rare. The 548th Night Fighter Squadron, based on Iwo Jima, spent most of July and early August 1945 flying patrols over the tiny volcanic island. They rarely encountered enemy aircraft. When they did, the engagements were brief and one-sided. The Japanese were down to their last reserves of fuel, aircraft, and trained pilots. Everything was being hoarded for the final defense of the home islands. On August 6th, the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, Bockscar dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. On August 14th, Emperor Hirohito recorded a surrender message that would be broadcast the next day. The Pacific War was effectively over. Everyone knew it. Most American units stood down from combat operations, waiting for the official announcement. But not the night fighters. Japanese aircraft were still in the air. Some pilots hadn't received word of the surrender. Others refused to accept it. And there was real concern about kamikaze attacks during the transition period. So the P-61s kept flying their patrols over Iwo Jima and Okinawa, just in case. On the night of August 14th, 1945, a Black Widow from the 548th Night Fighter Squadron named Lady in the Dark took off from Iwo Jima. This particular mission wasn't flown by the aircraft's usual crew. Another pilot and radar operator had been assigned the patrol. They climbed into the darkness over the Pacific, knowing the war would probably be over by morning but still maintaining full alertness. Iwo Jima ground control called out a bogey approaching low, altitude 4,500 feet, heading toward the island. The P-61 crew acknowledged and turned to intercept. The radar operator picked up the contact. Japanese aircraft, probably a fighter, closing on their position. The Black Widow maneuvered for attack position. Then something unusual happened. The Japanese pilot spotted the P-61. Visual contact in darkness was rare. Usually the Black Widow was invisible until it opened fire. But somehow, perhaps silhouetted against stars or cloud glow, the Japanese fighter saw its stalker. The enemy pilot reacted immediately, diving toward wavetop level and initiating violent evasive maneuvers. Lady in the Dark followed. The two aircraft screamed across the ocean surface in total darkness, the Japanese pilot pulling every trick he knew to shake his pursuer. Hard banking turns, altitude changes, speed variations. The P-61 crew stayed locked on target, their radar tracking every move. They closed to firing range but held their fire, trying to force the enemy aircraft to surrender or land. The chase continued for several minutes. The Japanese pilot pushed his Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar to its limits, maneuvering so aggressively that he was almost certainly exceeding structural stress limits. Then, in one final desperate turn, the Ki-43's wing clipped the water. The impact was catastrophic. The fighter disintegrated instantly, exploding in a ball of fire that briefly lit up the night sky. The P-61 crew had scored a kill without firing a single shot. They returned to base and filed their report. One enemy aircraft destroyed, forced into the sea during pursuit. No ammunition expended. It was unofficially recorded as one of the last aerial victories of World War II, but the date was significant. August 14th. The official ceasefire would begin at midnight. Captain Lee Kendall took off in Lady in the Dark on the night of August 15th to 16th, flying the first patrol of the official peace. The war was over. Everyone knew it. But orders were orders, and night fighters would continue flying until officially stood down. 45 minutes into the patrol, Iwo Jima Ground Control reported another bogey. Altitude 4,500 feet, approaching the island. Kendall and his radar operator, Lieutenant John Shearer, couldn't believe it. Another Japanese aircraft, nearly 24 hours after the war had officially ended. Ground Control confirmed the contact. The P-61 turned to intercept. Shearer picked up the target on radar. Closing range, 2 miles, 1 mile. Visual acquisition, a Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki, the type Americans called Tojo. Single-seat interceptor fighter, fast and maneuverable. The Tojo pilot spotted the Black Widow and immediately initiated evasive action, diving for the deck just like the previous night's encounter. Kendall followed, his radar operator calling out position and range. The Tojo pilot was skilled, pulling tight turns and altitude changes that would have broken visual contact against a conventional fighter. But the SCR-720 radar tracked every move. The chase became a running dogfight across the dark Pacific. Kendall would gain position for a firing solution, and the Tojo would break away at the last second. The two aircraft climbed, dove, and turned for several minutes. At one point, Shearer lost the radar contact as the Tojo disappeared into a cloud bank. They orbited, searching. The contact reappeared. They reacquired and continued pursuit. Then they lost him for good. The Tojo either escaped into heavy weather or crashed while trying to evade at low altitude. Kendall and Shearer returned to base without a confirmed kill. The next day, ground troops found wreckage of a Ki-44 Shoki that had crashed into the sea. The pilot was dead, his aircraft destroyed by controlled flight into terrain while maneuvering to escape an enemy he couldn't see but couldn't shake. Lieutenant Kendall was never officially credited with the kill. The engagement occurred nearly 24 hours after the war's official end. But his paperwork, documenting the action, survived. 45 years later, in December 1990, Kendall finally received the Distinguished Flying Cross at March Air Force Base in California, recognition for his actions in the war's final hours. The official last aerial kills of World War II went to a B-32 Dominator bomber crew flying Hobo Queen II on August 18th. They shot down 2 Japanese A-6M0 fighters that attacked their reconnaissance mission over Tokyo. But those were defensive kills against attackers who didn't know or didn't care that the war had ended. Lady in the Dark had the distinction of flying the last true night fighter missions of the war, downing enemy aircraft without firing its weapons through pure technological superiority and crew skill. The total confirmed kill count for P-61s across all theatres: 127 enemy aircraft and 18 Vone flying bombs. Those numbers seem modest compared to dayfighter aces who shot down dozens or hundreds of aircraft. But they don't capture the strategic impact. The Black Widow had fundamentally changed the calculus of night operations. Axis forces could no longer assume darkness provided protection. That psychological shift affected planning, tactics, and morale throughout the final year of the war. Consider what the P-61 represented technologically. In 1940, night fighting meant pilots using visual search in darkness, relying on moonlight, searchlights, and burning cities to spot targets. Success depended on luck, skill, and courage. 5 years later, the Black Widow could detect aircraft at 5 miles range in total darkness, track them through clouds, and destroy them before the enemy knew an engagement had begun. That progression from primitive to sophisticated happened in less time than it takes to design and build a modern fighter aircraft. The radar technology alone was revolutionary. The SCR-720 system weighed 412 pounds, used primitive vacuum tube electronics, required constant maintenance, and worked reliably enough that crews trusted their lives to it every mission. Modern fighter radar is infinitely more capable, but the fundamental principle was established in World War II. Electronic sensors would become more important than pilot vision for air-to-air combat. The crew coordination requirement was equally significant. Effective night fighting needed 3 specialists working as a single unit. The pilot controlled the aircraft and weapons. The radar operator managed the search and intercept. The gunner operated defensive systems and backup weapons. All 3 had to communicate constantly, trust each other completely, and maintain perfect discipline during engagements that might last seconds or hours. That multi-crew fighter concept influenced post-war interceptor design for decades. After the war ended, the P-61 continued serving. The newly created United States Air Force redesignated it the F-61 and used it as a long-range all-weather interceptor until 1948 in Air Defense Command and until 1950 in 5th Air Force. The last operational F-61 was retired in 1952. The final aircraft in government service, used for various test programs, retired in 1954. 36 Black Widows were converted into 15 reporter reconnaissance aircraft. The radar was removed, cameras were installed in the nose, and the aircraft flew photographic survey missions across the Pacific. Many of these 15 reporters participated in the first comprehensive aerial mapping of Pacific Islands. The same airframe that had been designed to hunt bombers in darkness proved equally capable of photographing terrain in daylight. One P-61 was used for ejection seat testing. The Germans had pioneered ejection seats during the war, using them in the Heinkel He-282 jet fighters. American engineers recognized that high-speed aircraft would need similar systems. They borrowed an ejection seat from a captured He-162, installed it in a P-80 Shooting Star, then decided the single-seat P-80 wasn't suitable for testing. They switched to a 3-seat Black Widow. On April 7, 1946, Sergeant Lawrence Lambert successfully ejected from a P-61B at 7,800 feet, traveling at just over 300 miles per hour. The test proved ejection seats could work in American aircraft, influencing safety systems for the next 80 years. Another P-61C participated in the National Thunderstorm Project from 1946 to 1949. Scientists removed the dorsal turret and installed meteorological instruments. The aircraft would deliberately fly into severe thunderstorms, measuring wind speeds, turbulence, and electrical activity. The Black Widow's robust construction and excellent flying characteristics made it ideal for penetrating violent weather. Data collected during these flights contributed to aviation safety and weather forecasting techniques still used today. The historical irony of the P-61's story is profound. German pilots in 1944 never expected to face radar-equipped night fighters with 10-mile detection range. They had spent years perfecting night fighting tactics based on visual search, ground control, and searchlights. The Americans arrived with technology that made all those techniques obsolete. German aircrew who survived encounters with Black Widows reported an enemy that could see them from impossible distances in total darkness. It felt like fighting ghosts. That's exactly what the British felt in 1940 during the Blitz. German bombers attacking at night with impunity, while RAF fighters struggled to find them. The psychological impact of helplessness in the face of an invisible enemy. 4 years later, The technology had advanced far enough that Americans could turn that helplessness back on the Germans. The hunters became the hunted, killed by an enemy they never saw. The Japanese experienced the same reversal. For 3 years, they had owned the night over the Pacific, lone bombers harassing American positions, preventing sleep, causing casualties. When the P-61s arrived, that advantage evaporated overnight. Japanese pilots would take off on harassment missions and simply never return. No distress calls, no evidence of combat. Just aircraft that disappeared into the darkness and never came back. The broader lesson was about technological warfare and industrial capacity. The P-61 existed because America had the scientific infrastructure to develop advanced radar, the industrial capacity to manufacture complex electronics, and the training systems to create crews who could use the technology effectively. None of that could be improvised. It required years of investment in education, research, and manufacturing capability. Germany had excellent scientists and engineers. They developed jet fighters, ballistic missiles, and advanced radar systems. But they couldn't produce them in sufficient quantities to matter strategically. The Heinkel He 219 Uhu night fighter was possibly as good as or better than the P-61 in pure performance terms. Only 294 were built compared to over 700 Black Widows. Germany's industrial base was being bombed to rubble while American factories expanded production. Japan faced an even steeper technological gap. They had skilled pilots and adequate aircraft early in the war, but they never developed radar technology comparable to Allied systems. Their night fighters relied on visual search. Their pilots learned to navigate by stars and find targets illuminated by fires. When they encountered P-61s with radar that could see through clouds and darkness, the disparity was so extreme it seemed like magic. The P-61 represented the future of air combat, not just because of its technology, though that was groundbreaking, but because it demonstrated principles that still govern fighter design 80 years later. Sensors matter more than speed. Information dominance enables tactical advantage. Crew coordination multiplies effectiveness. Training and doctrine are as important as hardware. Modern fighter aircraft, like the F-35 Lightning II, carry radar systems that can track hundreds of targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 100 miles. They can fire missiles at enemy aircraft beyond visual range, destroying them before the enemy even knows they're under attack. That's the P-61's operational concept, perfected through 8 decades of technological advancement. See first, shoot first, win without the enemy ever knowing you're there. The pilots and crews who flew Black Widows understood they were operating at the cutting edge of military technology. They knew the radar was experimental. They knew the aircraft was unproven. They flew anyway, trusting American engineering and their own training. Most of them survived the war. Some became aces. A few died in accidents or were shot down. All of them contributed to establishing air combat principles that define modern warfare. The German and Japanese pilots who encountered P-61s faced an impossible situation. They were skilled professionals, flying adequate aircraft using tactics that had worked for years. Then they encountered technology that rendered their skills and tactics irrelevant. No amount of courage or training could overcome the fundamental disadvantage of fighting blind against an enemy that could see perfectly in total darkness. The psychological impact was crushing. You can fight an enemy you can see. You can maneuver, shoot back, use terrain or clouds for cover. Against the Black Widow, you died without ever knowing why. That's the core lesson of the P-61 story. Technological superiority doesn't just provide tactical advantage. It imposes psychological costs on the enemy that undermine morale, disrupt planning, and force adoption of defensive tactics that reduce effectiveness. German and Japanese forces spent the war's final year knowing that American night fighters were hunting them. That knowledge affected every decision: when to fly, what routes to use, how to defend positions. The mere existence of the P-61 shaped enemy behavior even when the aircraft wasn't present. The legacy of the Black Widow extends far beyond its wartime service. It pioneered radar-guided air combat. It established multi-crew fighter operations. It demonstrated that purpose-built specialized aircraft could outperform adapted generalists. It proved that industrial capacity and technological innovation could overcome numerical and tactical disadvantages. Every modern all-weather fighter, every interceptor, every aircraft with look-down, shoot-down radar capability descends conceptually from the P-61. Today, only a handful of Black Widows survive. Most were scrapped after the war. A few exist in museums, preserved as examples of wartime innovation. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, displays a P-61C painted to represent Moonlight Serenade of the 550th Night Fighter Squadron. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Udvar-Hazy Center has another P-61C. The Mid-Atlantic Air Museum in Reading, Pennsylvania, is restoring a P-61B to flying condition, hoping to put a Black Widow back in the air for the first time in decades. These preserved aircraft serve as reminders of what American industrial and scientific capacity accomplished during World War II. In less than 5 years, the nation went from having no night fighter capability to fielding the world's most advanced radar-equipped interceptor. That achievement required coordination between government, industry, academia, and military services. It required engineers willing to solve problems that had never been solved before. It required pilots and crews willing to trust experimental technology with their lives, and it required the industrial capacity to build, deploy, and support hundreds of sophisticated aircraft across multiple theaters simultaneously. The German pilots who first encountered P-61s over France in August 1944 couldn't have known they were facing the future. They were focused on survival, on completing their missions, on getting back to base safely. When they reported being attacked by invisible fighters with impossible detection ranges, their intelligence officers struggled to believe the reports. It sounded too advanced, too capable. Surely the Americans couldn't have deployed such technology so quickly. But they had, and that technological surprise contributed to the psychological collapse of German and Japanese resistance in the war's final months. When your enemy can see in the dark and you can't, when they can hunt you across 10 miles of empty sky, when they can coordinate 3-man crews with perfect precision while you're flying alone or with limited support, the mathematics of survival become impossible. You're not losing because you lack courage or skill. You're losing because the other side brought technology you can't counter. That realization, repeated across thousands of missions in multiple theaters, helped break the Axis will to continue fighting. The P-61 didn't win World War II. No single weapon system did. But it contributed to the cumulative weight of Allied advantages that made continued resistance futile. Every German pilot who died without seeing his attacker, every Japanese bomber that disappeared over the Pacific, every night when Axis forces knew American fighters were prowling but couldn't do anything about it. All of those moments added up to the recognition that the war was lost. The night of August 14th to 15th, 1945, when Lady in the Dark flew its final combat missions, marked the end of an era. Night, fighting as it had been practiced since World War I was over. Visual search, searchlights, ground-directed interception, fighting by moonlight over burning cities all obsolete. The future belonged to radar, to electronic warfare, to sensors that could see through darkness and weather. The P-61 Black Widow had opened that future and demonstrated its effectiveness so conclusively that no one could ignore the lesson. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.